Welcome to the Where Do Gays Retire podcast, where we help you in the LGBTQ plus community find a safe and affordable retirement place. Join Mark Goldstein as he interviews others who live in gay-friendly places around the globe. Learn about the climate, cost of living, healthcare, crime and safety, and more. Now, here's your host, Mark Goldstein.
Welcome to another episode of the Where Do Gays Retire podcast. And today we have a special guest, Dave Hughes. He's a leading authority on retirement lifestyle planning. He has written over 100 articles on retirement lifestyle planning for his website, retirefabulously.com, and has published 3 books, Design Your Dream Retirement, Smooth Sailing into Retirement, and The Quest for Retirement, Utopia. From 2016 to 2017, Dave was a regular contributor to U.S. News on Retirement blog. In 2017, retirefabulously.com received the Best Senior Living Award from seniorhomes.com as one of the top retirement blogs by both reader polling and judges selection. Dave was named one of the nextavenue.org's top 50 influencers for aging in 2017. My God, I'm talking to a star. Following a successful 34-year career as a software engineer, trainer, course developer, and manager, Dave accepted an early retirement package and retired at the age of 56. During the final phases of his working career, Dave searched the internet for information about what life in retirement is really like. He discovered that at least 95% of all retirement-related information was focused on the financial aspects of retirement. Relatively little was being written about how to live a happy, fulfilling life during retirement, and of that, practically nothing was being written from an LGBT perspective. Dave created retirefabulously.com to fill that void. In addition to his books about retirement lifestyle planning, Dave writes gay fiction. He has released 2 novels, Maybe Next Year and Instant Adult, with more on the way. Dave is a jazz musician who plays trombone, electric bass, and steel pan. Dave resides near Phoenix, Arizona with his husband Jeff and their dog Maynard. Welcome, Dave, to the podcast. It's a pleasure having you on, and I'm really excited about talking about finding your retirement utopia. Does it really exist?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. And Dave, let's talk about where you currently live. You live in Chandler, Arizona, which is not too far from Phoenix. Is Chandler your so-called retirement utopia, or are you still in search of a utopia?
You know what? At this stage in our lives, it is. Now, I moved here just to get away from the cold and snow of the Northeast, and I moved in my late 30s, and at the time, searching for a retirement destination was the last thing on my mind, but I realized at one point that by accident I've sort of found it. And while I was researching the book, I did a lot of research into places both domestically and internationally for what makes a good place to retire and where would I like to live. And so far, very few things have topped Chandler. We're really happy here. It's close enough to Phoenix. I'm a little more of a suburb person than an urban person. Very pleasant surroundings. So we're happy here. That doesn't mean that we might not move in the future, especially if things start to get worse in the country. If we move, we will probably move outside the country as opposed to someplace else in the U.S.
Maybe we'll be neighbors.
Yeah, could be.
It's a possibility.
The coast of Spain is high on our list, too.
Oh, great. Yeah. So, that's where we're going to be exploring next year. Where in the Northeast did you move from to Chandler?
Sure. I'm originally from Ohio, but then I lived and worked in the Washington, D.C. area for 11 and a half years. So really mid-Atlantic as opposed to Northeast, but they still get plenty of snow and ice there.
Yeah, and you were done with that kind of weather,
Yep.
I suppose. Yeah, and it's just, except for the summer months here, the summer can be brutal and hot, but you know what? There's no utopia, I should say. There's no perfect place, and the rest of the year is just absolutely beautiful and gorgeous.
No, I totally agree. And the other thing is, ever since I was a little kid, I had a goal to have a house with a swimming pool. And we have that now. And so even when it's over 100 degrees in summer here, we can go out and get in the pool, and I'm in my own little paradise. So
Yeah.
I even enjoy the summers here.
Yeah. And I definitely understand that too. And it's the same thing when I lived in New York all those years. So we never really did much in the winter because it was just too cold to do anything in the winter. So we just kind of were opposite now. So
Yeah, that's right.
so why do you think many people feel the need to move after they retire?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm sure the answer varies among people, but part of it I think might be a feeling that maybe the grass is greener someplace else. This is nicer, but what if there's someplace even nicer? I'm sure for a lot of people who live in cold weather, they want to live someplace warmer. For many people, depending on how well they've been able to save for retirement, moving to someplace cheaper might be a big thing. And as we're finding out when our current social situation in our nation, some people might very much want to leave the U.S. But something that I'd like to give people to think about is this. A lot of times people approach moving when they retire as something they want to move away from. Like, I want to move away from the cold weather. I want to move away from all this heavy traffic and high cost of living, and I want to move away from conservative Republicans or whatever. But I'd like to also suggest that people think about, well, what do you want to move to? There's this old cliche about retirement is don't just retire from something, have something to retire to. And I think that also applies when you're thinking about moving.
That is so right on point. Yeah, for me, yeah, there are things that I want to escape. I wanted to escape the cold weather, so that's why I moved to Phoenix. But as far as retirement, yeah, the political climate, but I also think, what do I want for that chapter of life? What am I looking for? And there are things that I am looking for. So I'm looking for a place that doesn't have weaponry or guns for mass shootings, stuff like that. I want warm weather. I want to live in peace. I want to have a bunch of friends also that I can communicate with. So that's important too. So I think, yeah, you're right on point. Why are you moving and what are you looking for on the other end?
A lot of times people, where they live is determined by where their job is. And you may or may not be living someplace you like in order to have the job that you have.
Right.
But once you retire, the thing that retirement gives you is it's a great opportunity to finally design and construct the life for yourself that you want. And where you live is certainly a part of that.
Oh, yeah. That's a good way of putting it. So, what is important for you and most people when it pertains to finding a retirement destination?
Okay, well, I'm going to give you an answer that is probably different than 99% of the retirement articles you're going to see out there.
Oh, good.
You see lots of articles about, oh, here's the cheapest places to retire, or here's the place where people are happiest or healthiest, all these top 10 lists of places to retire. And you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, I want to retire someplace where I'll pay less taxes, or where the cost of living is lower, or where the weather's warmer, or whatever. My answer is none of the above. All those things are important. They should factor into your priorities, no question. I think the most important thing is, where can you live that you will best be able to do the things you want to do when you're retired? In other words, that really makes you get a handle on what do you want your day-to-day life to look like once you're retired. What hobbies or passions or pursuits do you want to do? And does the place you're thinking about living offer those? A great example is, as you read in the introduction, I'm a musician and so is my husband. So we really value having a place with a strong music community, both with opportunities for us to perform and opportunities for us to go hear concerts of nationally known performers when they come through town. So a place with a vibrant music community is very important to us. For non-musicians, that would be much less important. We don't play golf, but for golfers, some place with a lot of good golf courses would be important. So it's important to think about what do you want your day-to-day life to look like, and can the places you're thinking of provide you with that?
That's great advice. That definitely is, because I was going to say I crack up, but I really cringe sometimes when people post on Facebook, they post lists, retirement lists, like the healthiest places in the world to retire or the best places. And it's so subjective to how they find those statistics. And it really makes me cringe because people kind of attack those type of lists because they're like, oh, Mississippi or someplace remote is on the list and their city is not on the list. So kind of like those, yes, and totally agree. Getting back to your point, it's what do you want to do? What do you enjoy doing? And can I do that in this place that I want to go to? So that's very important because it's unfortunate, but I don't think there's that many chapters left after retirement. So you should be happy where you're going, and only you know that. So,
and sometimes the most day-to-day mundane things are more important than you think. For example, two of my best friends live on the Delaware coast, just north of Rehoboth Beach, and it's really nice there, and there are plenty of benefits to living there, but they are an hour away from Costco. And to me, that's like you're not even in civilization. Exactly. But other people's priorities are different. If you're a foodie, are there good foodie restaurants around? Or are your choices going to be Denny's and McDonald's and Applebee's?
Exactly.
Just a lot of times it's the little things that make a big difference.
Yep. I say to myself, okay, I really dislike driving. So for me, I'm an urbanite coming from New York originally. So for me, someplace where has a great infrastructure for transportation, something that's walkable, something that I can walk to the grocery or to the market or to the pharmacy or to a doctor without any problem. It would be nice if I had a sandy beach in walkable distance, but if that's possible, great. And I think it is, and I'm pretty sure it is. It's just a matter of where you want to be. Okay. So how about living in an LGBTQ friendly community? Is that important to you, or is it just, it's not that on your particular list? Is that very important at all?
Well, it sort of depends on whether you're defining community in the large term, like Chandler or the whole East Valley area of Phoenix or all of Phoenix, or if you're thinking of your immediate neighborhood or an actual retirement community sort of place. In other words, how big or small is community to you? I'm not totally sure I would want to live in a place that was entirely LGBT. I do appreciate some diversity in my life, but in terms of a place being LGBT friendly, I mean, that's certainly important. I don't want to live out the best years of my life having cars pass by yelling out faggot, or worrying if somebody's going to spray paint on my garage door or something like that, or beat me up or whatever, or just being treated well when you go out to eat in a restaurant. So I think living in a place that's LGBT friendly is really important. Having the place be all gay, to me, not as important. Some people may really like that, and that's your choice.
Exactly. Like some people live in Wilton Manors, which is almost all LGBT, it's all gay, and there are places like Palm Springs, also that the majority of people are gay. There are people that love that type of living, and I have nothing against it at all. And then there are some people who just want to live in a friendly, equal, diverse environment. That's me. I would rather live in a diverse environment if possible, but I have put some thought into Palm Springs myself, thinking it may not be too bad, but again, my first preference would be just to be in a diverse place where it doesn't matter. So that's what I really am looking for a place that you're well accepted and it really doesn't matter what you are. They just accept you for who you are.
It's one interesting phenomenon is that many years ago I became aware of an economist named Richard Florida who did a study, and the purpose of his study was, why do certain cities tend to attract high-tech employers and employees? And one of his colleagues was doing a study, why do certain cities tend to attract LGBT people into their communities? And they compared their list, and they were almost the same. And as they dug deeper into it, what they found is that both of those places had they were centers of creativity. They had lots of theater, lots of arts, lots of diversity in terms of cultures and restaurants and all sorts of things like that. So it was a very diverse and very creative environment that both of those populations of people thrived in. And I think those sorts of areas are by definition much friendlier to gay people.
I never thought of it that way too. I never even put thought into that. How do these gay communities start? It's like there's one move in and then another move in, but there has to be culture around and something attracting everyone. So for me, give me theater, give me the arts and stuff like that, and I'm happy.
And I think one hand washes the other, because I think when you get more gay people and more of other types of diverse people too, they will contribute to the creativity, and it's self-fulfilling.
Right. It just expands and kind of explodes from there. Interesting. Very interesting. So what are your thoughts on exclusive LGBT communities? Like, there are actually, let's say, okay, so Palm Springs is an exclusive LGBT community, so to speak. There are straight people that live there, but there are some communities like apartments that only cater to the LGBT crowd, or retirement communities. What do you think about those? And I know like some retirement communities around the country, some have not been as successful as someone would want them to be, and some are still hanging in there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, how do I put this? I wouldn't turn down living in one, but that's not really high on my list for, I'm definitely going to go retire to some all-gay place. Now, there are a few around the country, and fewer than you might expect given how many gay people there are in the United States. There's a place in rural New Mexico, a place in rural western North Carolina, and a couple in Florida. The complete housing developments. Somebody bought a piece of land and developed it and marketed it exclusively to the LGBT community. And Those places are still in existence. It's taken them a long time to sell all of their lots and build all their buildings. But the other concern I have with those is they bought the land where it was available and where it was relatively cheap, but that's also remote, especially in the cases of the one in New Mexico and the one in North Carolina. So you're far from hospital care and doctors, even far from most shopping and restaurants and all that. You are in your little isolated oasis out in a remote area. And I think I wouldn't want to do it for those reasons, not because it was all LGBT. Now, to get into apartments, there are a couple apartment buildings that are marketed primarily to LGBT people. The place can't say only LGBT people can live here, because that's just as discriminatory as saying no LGBT people can live there. But they can certainly market it to LGBT people and call it that. But there are a couple that are apartments that are open for anybody to rent. Many of the ones you read about are low-income oriented places in major cities. And those are government subsidized. A lot of times the rents are on a sliding scale. And the problem with those is they open up the waiting list in advance of the place being completed. They get way more demand than they can possibly handle. And even as the place opens, there's a waiting list of hundreds to get in. Those aren't really viable options unless you were really lucky to get in at the lottery they held when they were still under construction. So those aren't really on the table for most of us. And like I say, they're mostly for a low income anyway. But one last thing I'll say about this is in the 2000s, the early half of the 2000s, there was actually a large push to open up for a lot of people to build land and try to develop these LGBT communities. Most of them fell flat. For one thing, because they had trouble getting financing for it. For another, apparently there just wasn't as much demand from the LGBT community as they thought there would be. And then 2008 came and the real estate bust, and a good many of those places never really got off the ground, or else as they were just starting, they failed. But there are still a few left, but there really aren't very many.
There aren't. And I was thinking, if you bought a condo in a place like that and you wanted to sell, and now you're limiting yourself because it's quote unquote an LGBTQ residence, is that the HOA? Is the HOA going to let you sell to a heterosexual?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, in theory, that's illegal. But
Right.
you are right, though. You're going to have a much more limited market of people that you can sell that place to.
Right. And even if they say, okay, you can sell to a heterosexual person or couple, then the same thing, it kind of like happens, and more non-LGBTQ people move in, and the whole thought of that whole process goes down the tubes. So it's very difficult, I think, to even maintain that sort of relationship or that kind of apartment or condo complex. Okay. What do you think about 55 and older communities as it relates to the LGBT community? Do you think people are welcoming, or do you think in those type of communities it most caters to the straight families?
Yeah, I think there's no question that the almost entire majority, I'd say 95% or more, probably more like 98 or 99% of the people who end up in the 55 plus active retirement communities like Sun City or the villages in Florida or places like that are straight, white, conservative, and probably Christian. So we don't check most of those boxes. Now, having said, and so personally, I have no interest. And the other thing is, I don't really want to be in a self-contained community. And again, a lot of those communities are located kind of far out and away from the city because that's where they could get the land and the land was cheaper. I don't necessarily want to exist in a world without kids. I've never had them myself, but I guess I would rather stay out in the mainstream than isolate myself to just nothing but other older people. Now, that's a personal choice. Having said that, I have friends who live in Sun City, and they say they like it. And Sun City West, excuse me, Sun City Grand, and a few other places, that they have tons of these citizen groups. It could be for bridge playing or you name it.
Right.
But they have an Canasta, exactly. But they have an LGBT residence group, and some of them are officially sanctioned now. And so there are social groups specifically for the LGBT people. Now, my friends who live in Sun City say overall they're accepted real well. They don't stick pride flags out on their front lawn, but neither do they feel like they have to be closeted. Now, for many of the places in the Southeast, in various places in Florida and South Carolina and places like that, the people may not be nearly as accepting. I understand there's an LGBT group at the Villages. And so gay people do live in these places, but they don't appeal to me as a gay person. They don't even appeal to me as a retiree because honestly, I don't play golf, I don't play tennis or pickleball or shuffleboard, and I don't want to hang around nothing but older people.
Right. I agree. Yeah, I'm pretty much the same. I don't have the need to be around 55 and older. My friends are probably all 55 and older, most of them at least. But I don't need to live in a community that just caters to that. And again, what you said, conservative and whatnot. It just reminds me of when I made a detour from New York to Florida. I bought a house which was 30 minutes out of Tampa in Hillsborough County, so it's a Democratic county, but it was still in the suburbs. It was 30 minutes away from Tampa, and the community was beautiful. My neighbors were great. I was accepted. We were accepted, but I still was in a community where I was a real minority. I didn't. I think there may be maybe two other gay people that I knew in the whole community, and we started living there. And there was 100 homes, and by the time they were finished with the project, or they still haven't finished, but there are going to be 7,600 homes there, and I don't see a lot of gay people in those type of communities either. So for me, I moved and I kind of learned a good lesson because it was the price point that I was really looking at more. Where could I move from the East Coast that I could afford living elsewhere without maybe even having to work? So that was my thought process. Unfortunately, the thought process was wrong because we wound up not really being happy there, and wound up moving to Phoenix, which we love living here. We have a great, vibrant gay community here, and the weather to me is nicer. There's no bugs, so that's another thing on my list. I was a mosquito magnet. I don't want a place where there are bugs. I don't want a place where there are hurricanes, and I have to worry about that. I can take a haboob, a dust storm, for 10 minutes every so often. It doesn't happen very often. So you have to take everything into consideration.
Yeah, and another thing to consider about the 55 plus communities is the monthly fees can sometimes be really high. And it's because you're paying for all these amenities, like a golf course and that sort of thing. And in some cases, you're paying for landscaping and all that. And that may be nice because then you won't have to do it. So I think a lot depends on if you're going to use all those amenities, then maybe it's worthwhile to be paying for them. But otherwise, the monthly fees at those places can be really high.
Here's a perfect example. My HOA fee in Florida was $7. $7 was it a year? I can't remember. It was It was just ridiculous. But we had a CDD fee, was a community development fee that it was like broken down in two. One was taxable and one was operational. You can claim one part of it on your taxes. But anyway, that CDD fee was close to $7,000 a year. And
Wow.
I was paying for the kiddie splash park, the pools. They built two separate pools, beautiful with a slide and everything. All of these amenities. They had like an outdoor gym and walkways. It was absolutely beautiful, but you pay for all of that. And quite frankly, I didn't use any of it. I used the pool once a year, twice a year, and I don't use the slide in the pool or the kiddie parks and the water fountains and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely right. You're paying for it somewhere.
Right.
Okay. So retirement living may be the final chapter in one's life. How important is it to get it right? And what research should you do before making a move?
Some people always say, well, go live someplace. If you don't like it, you can always move again later. But I think that, yeah, and we probably thought that way throughout most of our lives. But during most of our lives, we still had jobs and we always knew there'd be more money coming in. I think when you get ready to make a choice for where you want to live when you retire, I suggest that you think about that as this is going to be the last place I move, at least until it gets near the end when you have to move into an assisted living facility.
Right.
Because number one, the older you get, just the more taxing it is to move.
I hate moving.
And yeah, I know. And plus it's expensive. And of course, from this point on, your finances are a bit more finite.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to put a lot of consideration and think of it as this is going to be where I move finally. And so the way to prepare for that, I think first of all, what we've already talked about, really think about what you want your life to be like, but try to go there on as much of an extended vacation as you can. Like after you retire, see if you can rent an Airbnb house for a couple months or house sit. Try to live in a place for a longer period of time than just a week, like you would do on vacation. And when you get there, don't do the touristy things. Try to live your life every day. Go shop in the local stores. Go eat in the local restaurants. Try to live your life as close to that as close to how you're going to live after you retire as you can. And what else? There are a lot of times there's a Facebook group for just about any community. Join it. See what people are talking about. See what they're complaining about, what they're concerned about. And people will complain about anything, but still, it'll give you an idea of what it's really like to live in a place. On my website, retirefabulously.com, I actually have a checklist you can download called 21 Things to Look For in the Community You're Going to Move to, or something like that. But it gives you suggestions for things to pay attention to, like, are there a lot of empty shopping centers? Or are there a lot of closed businesses? Things like that, because those point to a stagnating community. And once a community starts stagnating, prices or crime will go up, that kind of thing. Whereas if the area has a lot of prosperity, like say they have a high-tech industry or other current industries, and it's growing and prospering, that speaks well for, will this community continue to be prosperous going forward? And it's a nicer environment to live in, even if you're not looking for a job. Those are just a few, but you'll discover things like where is the nearest Costco or Trader Joe's, or do they have good restaurants here, or whatever it is. But try to go there and live your life as much like the locals do as possible. And the other thing is, of course, I I know this is going to get into a question you're going to ask me later, but definitely rent for a year. Because if you find out that you've made a mistake and it looked nice, but it really wasn't what you want, you have less invested than if you had bought a house.
So true. Great points, Dave. So what we're thinking of, so I'm still working and I work 40 hours a week. So hopefully I have enough time next year saved up where we can get away for a month. So we're thinking, okay, a month is better than 2 weeks, but we're kind of like split. First, we started with 4 choices. Now we're down to 2 choices because of all the research that we've done and all of the YouTube videos. So we have 2 cities picked out in Spain that we'd like to visit, and we'd like to live there. Even though I think 2 weeks is too short a period of time in each place, that's all I have to work with at this point, and I don't know if we're going to make a decision. We could say, well, I guess we can, but that's our plan. We're going to live at an Airbnb and in town, not at a hotel or anything, and we're going to live like the locals live and see what it's like. We're going to go to the market. We're going to bring the stuff back, the groceries back to the Airbnb. We're just going to try to depict ourselves as living there for that period of time and see how we like it. But the thing is, it's difficult even making a decision with that. And yes, at first we're saying we're looking at condos and we're going to buy because we always bought something. Since we're together for 22 years, we've always purchased something. And now we're saying, no, I don't think we're going to do that. We're going to rent because, number one, it's a foreign country. So we don't know what it's really like. So we're going to try to rent furnished if we do make a decision, because if we do make a decision that we're not happy with, we can just pick ourselves up and go to the next place. So your points are very, very true.
Even if you end up in the city that you like, say, I know you've mentioned Alicante, for example. Let's say you go there and you decide you like the city. It still takes a while to discover where the nicer neighborhoods are and where a great place to live is going to be and all that. And when you go there for your month, try your best to avoid going to the beach every day and you strolling through the tourist shops and all that, because you're not going to do that very often when you live there.
Right.
And the other thing is that in many places there are expat forums on websites, and of course a lot of places the people have Facebook groups for expats as well. Join them well in advance, and number one, you'll make some friends, which is really useful once you live there, but also you'll get a lot better feel for the types of culture shock, problems that other expats have faced when they live there, what people like about an area and what they don't. So you can now it's easier than ever to leverage other people's experience.
It is, definitely. Even before our podcast today, we had met this couple online from Alicante through other friends of ours from Alicante that have done a podcast. And we had a Zoom with them for about an hour and a half today talking about everything. It was really great. Also, it was there 6 p.m. and it was early in the day for us, so their sun was going down and we were just starting the day. But it was really cool. They were out on the terrace and they were right in the middle of Center City, so you could see the places of interest actually right from their terrace, which was so refreshing and nice to know that they're only a Zoom away right now, that we can ask them just about anything. So that's great. Do you consider like the cost of living ahead of other things like making friends and socializing? Because to me, I'm very social, and I would need to move to a place that I could make friends. Here in Phoenix, we were so fortunate. We actually knew a couple from Connecticut where we lived who knew people here, and they had lived out in Ahwatukee at the time, but now they live right across the street from us. But they introduced us to this group who, it's a huge group, and out of that group, we're friends with a bunch of people. But we were so fortunate in finding those friends, and we're kind of social, so we like to keep up the socialization. But do you think, what comes first, socializing, you're being happy, or the money aspect? I guess you have to do both.
Well, yeah. And in the money question, like so much else in the world, it depends on how much you have or don't have. If you reach retirement and you found that you haven't saved as much as you ideally might have, and you realize you're going to have to economize, then suddenly the cost of living at a place, and similarly the taxes that you'll pay, become an important part of your consideration. But once you get beyond a certain point and you can live in a wide range of places and afford to live there, then I think it makes less difference. I know that sounds really obvious. I read once where somebody said that if you have less than $500,000 saved up, then your finances are always going to be a concern, and you might experience some unhappiness because of things you have to do without, or places you have to live that might not be where you'd otherwise choose to live. But once you got above 500,000, your happiness doesn't really increase beyond that. In other words, having $1 million doesn't necessarily make you twice as happy as
right.
having $500,000. Once you get to a certain spot, then the relative cost of living doesn't really make as much difference. And you're going to be happier, well, being where you're going to be happy. People put a lot of emphasis on, oh, let's go to some place where the taxes are lower and all that.
Right.
And again, if you really need to be concerned about money, that's important. But otherwise, it's like, how happy is it going to make you knowing I saved $20,000 a year on my taxes? Well, that's actually a lot, but I saved $2,000 a year in my taxes. Is that going to make you happier?
Right.
So really, you get to a point where that plateaus off and it doesn't make as much difference.
Yeah, and that brings me back to my Florida experience, because there I was looking for cost of living, and Florida has no state taxes, but who knew that they charge other things in other ways to make up for that no tax. So you're really paying a lot in insurance. You have to take everything into account, because now you have hurricane insurance, or you have to, your house might blow down. So hurricane insurance is very costly. In fact, it's cost prohibitive in Florida. It's like hardly anybody even has it because it costs so much. Then there's sinkhole insurance. You have to really, there's so much to really learn, and sometimes you don't learn until you're there. So it's too late.
At various points when I've been writing articles for Retire Fabulously and writing about places to live and all that, I would try to dive into what is the taxation like in each state. And there's a website called taxfoundation.org that has a lot of really good information. But what I found is the more you dive into it, the more confusing it gets, the more it makes your head hurt.
Yep.
And each state is different, but you have to realize that at the end of the day, they're going to get their money from somewhere, some way. So there's certain states that have no personal income tax. But guess what? They're going to get it from property taxes or sales tax or other ways, gasoline tax, you name it. Other states have no sales tax, but they're going to get it from other ways. And the other thing is, what is the state or the community providing you for what you pay in tax dollars? And some of these low tax states aren't providing you with very much other value and benefits because they're collecting so little tax. So you get what you pay for.
I was just going to say that.
Exactly. There are a few states that are particularly high tax. You might want to stay away from those. But once you get beyond those few, there's not that much difference. And again, at the end of the day, are you going to be happy there?
Right. Yeah. So I'd learn my lesson again. I'd rather pay a little bit more and not look at those, what states are tax-free or anything like that, than be happy. Happiness is a lot of things, because I don't want to be miserable moving in my retirement years. Whenever we moved to another state, we always bought a house or a condo. When we retire and possibly move abroad, we talked about renting financially for the long term. And I want to go a little bit more into that. It's like, have you ever figured out, like, we kind of try to put it on a spreadsheet. So you have to figure out when it's really difficult. It's like, when you think you're going to pass away, and how many years do you have left? And what do you think is the average rent price versus your expenses and your buy price? And we tried to put that together, and it kind of, what we found was almost the same. Renting might have been a little bit higher, but not to a really big degree. So now we're kind of thinking, first we thought, yeah, we'd rent for a year or so, make sure that this is where we want to be. But now we put in more thought, and we're like, do we even want to buy? Especially in a foreign country, where you won't have headaches just renting. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there are several things that factor into the equation. And throughout our working careers, like you say, we've been the same way that you just described. You're much better off buying than renting. At least when you have a mortgage, you're gradually paying down your principal, whereas whenever you rent, you're just throwing your money away every month. But when you're retired, the equation changes in a few ways. One is, and again, a lot of people say, oh, have your mortgage paid off before you retire. And there's value in that advice, but the other thing is the money that is sitting in the value of your home is not invested and is not earning any money for you. Personally, we still have a mortgage. We refinanced in 2013, and we were able to get a 15-year mortgage at 2 5/8%.
Good going.
And we still have about $120,000 left on that mortgage. And I thought, well, I could take $120,000 out of my investments and pay it off and be done with it. But that money is earning a lot more than 2 5/8% where it's invested.
Right.
So it's actually, it can be beneficial to have some of the value of your home invested in things as opposed to just sitting there so you don't have to pay a mortgage.
Yeah.
The second thing is, of course, when you rent, when something breaks or goes wrong, it's the landlord's responsibility, both financially and in terms of time and effort, to fix that thing, as opposed to yours when you own. And another aspect of that, which kind of tags on to my first point, is that if you sell your house, of course, you get the infusion of all the money that you've built up in equity in your home. And then you go overseas, like say to Spain, and you rent, you have the use of all that money. Not that you should run out and spend it all right away,
right,
but
you're going to need it.
Yeah, you
rent.
have the use of that money. Exactly. The final thing I'll say about that is this varies from country to country, but certainly when you go to Spain, when you rent first, you can learn more about how real estate really works. And it's different in different countries. Sometimes it's a lot different. For example, in Mexico, if you live within, I think it's within 100 kilometers of the border and 50 kilometers of the ocean, foreigners are not allowed to actually own their property. And they get around it by you create a trust with the bank, and you're a trustee of that trust.
Yes.
And so you can effectively buy the property, but you're buying it through that vehicle. And you need to know about that. And the last thing I'll say about that is there are some countries, Argentina currently is one of them, that limits the amount of money you can take out of the country per year. So that means if I moved to Argentina and I bought a house and then decided later to move out of Argentina, a lot of the value in that house, even if I sell the house and have the money, I might only be able to remove a certain amount of that money from the country every year. And those are things you really need to learn before you buy overseas.
Absolutely. Good points. Great points. Yeah, I'm thinking to myself, where I live now, there could be some arguments within the HOA and the residents. I can't imagine going to a foreign country, living in a high-rise condo building with a foreign language that you don't really know and know what's going on with the HOA. That's another thing to think about. It's like, do you want that responsibility as well? So there's so many things to think about.
There really are.
Okay, so let's see. How about good, affordable health care? That's really on top of our list too, because we're not getting any younger, and we do have some pre-existing conditions. So how important should one prioritize health care on their list as choosing a retirement destination? I know me, for one, it's pretty high on the list. So not only the walkability and the amenities and the cost of living, we're looking at this whole picture, and healthcare is really, really important, because if we need it, we're going to need excellent healthcare. And we do have very good healthcare here. And again, we're talking about healthcare and healthcare insurance too. So how important is that to you?
Yeah, clearly it's important, because let's face it, even if we're healthy when we're in our 60s or into our 70s, sooner or later, our bodies are going to start going downhill, and we're going to need health care. There's just no question about that. And I think the quality of the health care isn't really the issue, because in most other first world and even second world countries, developed countries, their health care is pretty good. If you look at the last time a really good survey comparing quality of health care across nations was done was like 2010. And the U.S. wasn't even at the top of that list. It was fairly high, but the point is, most places that we will consider retiring to, and by we, I mean that this is the broad overall we, not me and my husband. Most places that are desirable retirement destinations probably have very good health care. France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, most places in Europe, even most places in Central America. India even has pretty good quality health care. So it isn't the quality, it is certainly the price. Now, virtually any other place you move outside of the U.S., the healthcare is going to be cheaper. No question.
Yeah.
You will need to buy insurance, but even that is cheaper. You'll definitely save money moving someplace else for healthcare. But here's the factor that I think is most important, and that is, how close are you to it? I read a story recently. Somebody was in P-Town, Provincetown, and they got injured or something and they needed to go to the hospital. The nearest hospital is an hour away.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, and people dream of retiring to that cabin in the mountains or the cabin around a lake, small town, rural places. And they're beautiful in many ways, certainly safe and relaxing and serene, but you may be an hour or two away from a hospital and even from a decent selection of doctors and specialists.
Yeah.
The proximity to good health care, I think, is the biggest factor as opposed to how good it is, because you can probably find good health care for most of what ails us in a lot of places. And even in the U.S., I just turned 65 earlier this year, and now I'm on Medicare. That has made a huge difference.
Next month is mine.
Yeah. I'll tell you, even once you get into the realm of Medicare, healthcare becomes much more manageable here in the U.S. So again, I think your biggest issue is proximity.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's another thing that we look for. So we want to be able to walk everywhere and walk also to a doctor or a doctor if we can take public transportation. No, I would rather be walkable to a doctor and a hospital within 10 minutes. That's I don't know if I'm realistic, but I'm going to certainly scope that out.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind. And one thing I'll say about Chandler, in a way, it's similar to the place you described when you lived outside of Tampa. It was a beautiful area, but you had to drive half an hour to get into town.
Yep.
Chandler is kind of that way, except we do have a lot more of what we need on a day-to-day basis within just a mile. And one thing is, within a mile, we have a major hospital, all kinds of doctors and specialists, several assisted living homes, the whole range of medical services within a mile of where we live.
Yep.
Again, that wasn't forefront in our mind when we picked our house, but as it turns out, we have that, and we're very thankful for it.
Yep, and you also have the neighboring communities like Gilbert and Mesa as well. Yeah, it's definitely something to think about, the proximity of where your hospital is or your doctor. How about, so here's one, culture shock. It's a real thing, especially when moving to another country. Cultures are very different, even from state to state. So, you know, from New York to Tennessee, that's different. Is there anything you can do to minimize the impact of culture shock? And culture shock, I think you can get depressed being in a place that you're not used to, or you're homesick for your from your last place where you lived.
Yeah, you're right. There is culture shock moving from one area to another in the U.S., but I think we have a pretty good idea of what that is. You just mentioned the example of moving from New York City to someplace in Tennessee. We have a pretty good idea of what to expect.
Right.
And I think that's the most important thing about learning about culture shock in another place. Find out what it is, what you need to expect. And fortunately, there are a lot of good articles about that on the internet. And one thing that I've learned is very important is when you're moving someplace outside the U.S. is an expat community. And when I started on this journey of writing about places to go retire, I've totally come 180 degrees on this. I used to think, oh, don't isolate yourself into an expat community. Find a place where you can get out into the community, learn the language, meet the people, assimilate into your community and all that. And that is still good advice. Definitely, if you go someplace where English is not the primary language, you should learn the language and attempt to assimilate. But I've really learned to appreciate the value of expat communities. And they can really help you with the culture shock. Yeah. Because at least there's some people for you to socialize with and interact with that you can do so on terms that you're used to. In some places, the culture shock can be kind of extreme. I think one of the most universal things is most other places you go, they operate on a much more relaxed timetable.
Yes.
And that's a hard thing to get used to. But there are other cultural norms too, like when you should bring gifts for things, or things that you say or don't say. that kind of thing.
Or should you tip?
Yes, tipping. That's a huge one. Do you haggle and barter? Do you haggle over prices or not?
Right.
Lots of those things are very different from place to place. And again, we live in an age where so much information is available on the internet, and there are expat forums to go to learn about those things. Really do your homework. Really talk to people who already live there and learn, because there will be lots of culture shock. Don't pretend that you go to someplace, even if it's like Lake Chapala in Mexico, where there's a large English-speaking expat community, or Puerto Vallarta, or various places in Europe. There's still a lot of things you need to learn about in interacting locally. And the other thing to keep in mind is, the people who already live there, they'll have a wide range of how they feel about expats moving into their country. Some people are openly hostile toward it. Look how large segments of the U.S. population treat immigrants.
Oh, yeah.
So
pretty bad.
Keep in mind that in many other places, I found Latin America is actually a lot better about welcoming us than we are about welcoming them.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, they don't need you. They have their families and friends in their community, and they're not saying, oh boy, some foreigners moved in.
Right.
Let's get to know them and welcome them in. They don't need you. Even if they're indifferent or even friendly, you need them a lot more than they need you. That's really something to keep in mind.
And I keep in mind that I'm an immigrant. You may call it expat. I could call it immigrant. And I'm in their country. And I have to be respectful of that. And I have to go in with an idea of, hey, I'm not going to do it the U.S. way, because that's not the way to do it. And if you're accustomed to everything being done on the spot, if you're used to going into a restaurant and getting served and having a waiter or waitress pay attention to you so closely, it's not going to happen in another country. It's just the way it is. They're laid back. They're not there to turn tables. You may want the check, and you're going to probably have a hard time. But you know what? You're in their country, so relax and try to enjoy it. You have to learn what their culture is about, and you're in their country, so immerse yourself.
Yeah, you really need to constantly ask yourself, does this really matter?
Right.
And you have to raise your threshold a lot for what matters and what's trivial and what doesn't matter, because so many things will be different. I wrote a whole chapter in my book, The Quest for Retirement Utopia, about culture shock. And there's all kinds of differences. There's differences in communication style, whether you imply a lot of things and not say them directly, or whether you confront people directly, differences in humor and senses of humor, differences in living standards. One thing you find, especially in Mexico and throughout Central America, is middle-class people have a much lower standard of living than we're used to.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is we talk in the U.S. a lot about the middle class is disappearing. In many other places, particularly Latin America, there's a much greater difference between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
And by virtue of the fact that we go there, we are almost certainly going to be among the haves.
Haves, yeah.
And that factors into culture a lot. But even things like homophobia and sexism and ageism and things like that are very different in other places.
Yeah.
Sometimes better, sometimes worse.
Right. It's just a matter of educating yourself on what their culture is all about. Excellent. So what resources do you use to learn about different retirement destinations?
Well, I've already talked about a couple of them. Expat forums on the internet and expat Facebook groups. Very good resources. There are several websites that are very good for expat resources. There's expat.com and several others like it. Yeah. One thing, and again, I don't want to like totally keep harping on my book, but when you buy the book, I mentioned I have a website that I tell you what the URL is in the book. I have tons of resources on there about both expat forums, things about buying insurance, where you can go to find immigration law and immigration attorneys, a number of other things like that to find expat resources. But a couple of the main ones I think are find expat groups, and there are. One thing I want to talk about for just a second is a lot of people, if you're thinking about moving overseas, you've probably encountered internationalliving.com.
Yes.
And I want to caution you about that. The information on that website is good, but they're only giving you the positive side. They really talk about retiring internationally with rose-colored glasses. They tell you all the great things about retiring overseas, but none of the downsides. But that website does have some good resources. Just keep in mind that they're only giving you the good sides.
Yep.
And you're going to get the real picture from websites that are dedicated to the expat experience. And I keep talking about expats. Keep in mind, those are not just people who are retiring overseas. Sometimes they are people who are going overseas to work. Mm-hmm. But still, it's many of the same considerations and many of the same resources.
Yep. It's very good to know. I belong to so many expat groups on Facebook. It's like, it's hard to keep up at times because there's separate expat groups for different locations, and then you have the general ones, but they are very, very informative, and I try to absorb everything that I see in there as well. Great.
Yeah.
And thanks for letting us know about your book, and we'll get to that also because we'll put that in the show notes. So
sure.
What are your favorite retirement destinations in the U.S. as well as abroad?
Okay, well, we'll talk about U.S. first. Again, I really like Chandler and the surrounding communities, or really any place in the Phoenix area. I'm really very happy here. It's a good combination of Phoenix is a big city, but because it is so spread out, there's a plus and a minus to that. The plus and minus is you don't feel like you're in the extreme population density that you are in, say, New York City.
Right.
Or in other big major cities in other countries around the world. So it has more of a medium town feel to it. The downside, of course, is except in certain places in downtown or midtown Phoenix, you are going to drive a lot more. So there is that. But overall, I really like this area a lot. I think it's cost effective for the benefits that you get and for the amenities. And it's just a nice area. So I'm happy here. If I were to pick a few places other than Phoenix, you mentioned Palm Springs. In a lot of ways, the two are very similar. Palm Springs, I think, may be a little more pricey. Taxes may be a little higher, but it's definitely more gay and more liberal overall. So there is that. Certain places in North Carolina, I might be willing to consider, like Asheville or Durham, Chapel Hill, that area. Very nice. Reasonable cost of living, pretty liberal, some culture available. I've heard many great things about Asheville. So that would be nice. Yeah, where else? In California, possibly Oregon. A lot of nice areas there. Some areas are pricier. Of course, it's not as hot, but they don't really get extreme winter either. That would be fine. So those are a few. Now, as I mentioned, we're probably not going to move unless it is to move outside the U.S. because things just go to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
So the shit hits the proverbial fan.
Right.
The places that are on my short list, certainly Spain and Portugal. Malta. Malta in a lot of ways is similar to Arizona climate-wise. It is English-speaking. Cost of living's pretty reasonable. Very gay-friendly. It has a few downsides, but that would be good. One place, Mexico's obviously very popular. And there are several places Yeah, it's close. That's one of the biggest things. If you have to decide when you move overseas, how often are you going to want to come back home?
Right.
Do you have family here? Are you going to come back to visit people for the holidays or for weddings and funerals or things like that? Because even if you move to a faraway place and it's nice and it's inexpensive and you're saving money, it doesn't take too many airplane flights back to the U.S. to negate those savings.
Right.
Having said that, I think one place that is, I think, one of the world's best kept secrets is Uruguay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it has very good infrastructure, very reasonable cost of living. One thing that's different about Uruguay, a very stable government, which you can't always say about Latin America places, it has much more of a middle class. There's much less very wealthy and very poor. It's much more egalitarian.
You do your homework, Dave.
Yeah, I believe me, I've researched these places a lot, and not just for my books, but just because where would I like to live?
Right.
Because we've thought a lot about moving other places. But anyway, Uruguay, best kept secret as far as I'm concerned. Another thing to think about, though, is you can't just retire anywhere because there are immigration laws, and there are a lot of places that might be nice to retire that just don't have an immigration visa that's compatible with retirement. I would love to go live in Australia or New Zealand, but it is difficult to immigrate there right now.
It is, yes. I don't think, after all, talking about all of this, is there a retirement utopia?
That's a really good question. And that kind of ties back into all these top 10 lists. Is there really a top 10 place to retire? Is there really a retirement utopia? And the answer is overall no, because there are downsides to any place you want to live. But the retirement utopia, frankly, there isn't a retirement utopia that's right for everyone. The whole point to my book is to help you find the place to retire that is right for you. And that all has to do with the things we've talked about. Where can you have the amenities to live your life the way you want to live? In my case, for example, it's a music community. But it's finding the ideal balance of cost of living, having things you need in close proximity, having the amenities you need.
Yeah.
And you need to weigh what's most important for you. And then a few places that satisfy that check off most of the boxes will surface.
Excellent.
So there isn't a retirement utopia, but there could be a retirement utopia that's right for you.
For you. Perfect. I love that. Thank you. So what advice would you give to our listening audience?
There's really only one thing I can think of that we haven't already talked about, and that is this. Vacation destinations rarely make a good place to retire. And
I agree.
So many people think, here's a great example, Hawaii. Hawaii's lovely. It's a great place to go on vacation. When you go there on vacation, you're going to go to the beach every day. You're going to stay in a nice hotel. You're going to eat in the nice restaurants and everything. When you go to live there permanently, you're probably not going to go to the beach every day. You're probably not going to be staying in a hotel. Then you start thinking about, gee, are there theaters I can go to? Are there bands I can play in? Whatever it is. And the other thing is, vacation destinations are often places with a lot of tourists. And when you go there as a tourist, of course, that's what you expect.
Right.
But do you want to live permanently in a place where there's tourists everywhere? No. Probably not. Vacation destinations are nice because they are a break from your routine.
Right.
They are something to escape to. But living there permanently, a lot of the luster is going to wear off, and you're going to find a place with a lot of tourists and a lot of traffic, and that's probably going to be expensive, and all that. So vacation destinations rarely make good retirement destinations.
Great advice. And yeah, for instance, at first I had a vacation destination in Spain on there, and that was Barcelona. And for many people, it's a great place to live, but for me, it's not a great place for me because it doesn't check off. I don't want to be in the middle of the tourist area as well, and it doesn't check off a few of the things for me personally. It might for other people, but doesn't for me personally. But that's an example.
For Portugal, a lot of people talk about the Algarve.
Yeah.
And ideal weather, beautiful beaches, spectacular cliffs, all kinds of stuff like that, but mostly small towns.
Right. It gets old.
And yeah,
It's like I'm an urbanite. That's exactly what I spoke with my husband. He's like, well, how about the Algarve? It's warmer there. And I was like, you know what? It's small towns, and I don't thrive in small towns. I need big city urban type towns where I can walk to everything. So
yeah.
and
In Spain, the Canary Islands would be great. I'd love to go there on vacation.
yeah.
I don't know if I would live there.
No, me neither. Excellent. So Dave, where could we find you on social media? Tell us about all the different places and books. Where could we buy your books?
Sure. So, first of all, retirefabulously.com. All the books are on there, including links for where you can buy them. You can buy them from Amazon, Barnes & Noble. The ebooks are also on Apple Books, Kobo, you name it. So plenty of options for where to buy the books. You can, for a couple of the books, you can download sample chapters. So a lot more information about the books are on retirefabulously.com. I also have a Facebook page, also called Retire Fabulously. Honestly, there's not much activity on there now. I post things there occasionally, but not so much. So yeah, probably the website, as you mentioned, there are about 100 articles, and they're categorized by tags. So you can find categories, like there's a category specifically for, I call it fabulous places to retire. And there's several countries profiled and several other articles about things you really need to consider before you retire overseas. So there's that sort of thing. Also articles about places to retire in the U.S. And there's articles in other categories too. Articles specifically about LGBT concerns. And same thing in the book. In the book, there's a whole section of the book devoted to LGBT concerns. There's a section in the book devoted to retiring overseas as opposed to retiring in the U.S. There's chapters on being nomadic retirees, living on a houseboat, living in an RV, things like that. So most of the stuff online is on retirefabulously.com.
You covered it all. You are a wealth of information for the retirement community. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah.
You're welcome. It's a topic that has fascinated me. When I travel somewhere, I always think, what would it be like to live here? So
Right.
I go home and I research it to death. So
I love
it's
it.
sort of a passion of mine.
That is great. Again, thank you so much for your time that you took to tell our audience on how to retire, where your utopia is. It was just great listening and talking to you. So thank you again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And again, thank you for having me on. I really admire what you have done with the Where Do Gays Retire Facebook group. You got far more traction and visibility than I ever did. You just found the right medium and the right approach, and it's attracted tons of people. My kudos for that. And I think plugging all the people and the resources you have together with maybe some of the things that I've put together, I think is there's a nice symbiosis there. Let's put it that way.
Definitely.
So thank you for inviting me on.
Agree. Oh, of course, yeah. And Where Do Gays Retire, it has exploded over the years. So now we're up to like 12,000, almost 400 members. And I figured, what better way is it to get the word out through a podcast? So this is my new hobby. which I'm happy with. It's such a great education for me as well. So thank you so much again, Dave.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Where Do Gays Retire podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast and consider making a donation by clicking the coffee cup on any page at www.wheredogaysretire.com. Each cup of coffee that you buy costs $5 and goes towards helping us continue the podcast. Thank you for your continued support.